I've lived long enough to know that kindness doesn't always come with a speech. Most of the time, it's quiet. A door held open. A nod across a room. A chair pulled out when someone looks like they've got nowhere left to sit. This story reminded me of that the night I heard about a widow who arrived in a town where nobody knew her name. The stagecoach door slammed shut behind her. Clara stood alone on the wooden boardwalk, dust settling on her worn boots. The canvas bag clutched against her chest like it was all she had left in the world. She counted the coins in her palm without looking down. 43 cents. The ridged edges pressed into her skin, cold, familiar, not enough. The smell found her first. Roasted meat. Fresh bread. Her stomach twisted hard. And she kept walking. Holloway's eatery glowed yellow through calico curtains. Inside, families sat at tables. Forks scraped tin plates. A child laughed at something his father said. Clara stopped at the window. Her reflection stared back, half her face touched by the warm light inside, the other half lost to the coming dark. Her hand reached for the door. It stopped. Inside. A man looked up from his plate. He saw her. If you're watching tonight from a place where the coffee's still warm and the evening's getting quiet, I'd love to hear where you're joining from. And if you've been enjoying these stories but haven't subscribed yet, I'd be grateful if you'd consider it. It helps more than you know. The man didn't wave, didn't smile. He reached across the table and pulled out the empty chair across from him. Clara's hand fell away from the door handle. Her feet wouldn't move. He nodded once, slow, then went back to his food. She pushed the door open. The bell above it jingled, sharp and bright. Heads turned. A woman with a child on her lap. 2 men in dusty work clothes. An old man with a coffee cup halfway to his lips. They looked, then looked away. Clara crossed the room. The floorboards creaked under her boots. She could feel the heat from the coal stove in the corner, smell the coffee and the beef stew and something sweet pie. Maybe. Cooling somewhere she couldn't see. She sat down across from him. His plate held stew and cornbread, steam still rising. He picked up his fork, cut the cornbread in half, pushed the plate toward her until it sat between them, the larger portion on her side. He didn't ask if she was hungry, didn't ask her name, didn't ask anything. He just started eating his half. Clara's hands stayed in her lap, her fingers twisted together, knuckles white. The smell of the stew filled her nose onions, beef, something earthy like carrots. Her stomach clenched so hard her back curved. She picked up the fork. The tin was warm from sitting near his hand. First bite. The meat was tender, the gravy thick with flour. Her eyes closed before she could stop them. When she opened them, he wasn't watching. He was cutting his cornbread into smaller pieces, chewing slow, looking at nothing in particular. He was giving her room to eat without being seen. "Ethan Callahan," he said, still not looking up. She swallowed. "Clara." Her voice came out rough, unused. "Just Clara." He nodded. That was enough. From the kitchen doorway, a woman in a flour-dusted apron stood watching, gray hair pinned back, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't say anything, but her eyes stayed on Clara, measuring, weighing. Ethan finished his portion, laid coins on the table, stood, picked up his hat, and tipped it once in Clara's direction. Then he was gone. The bell jingled behind him. Clara sat alone with half a plate of stew and the weight of a stranger's kindness pressing against her chest. The woman in the apron was still watching. The boarding house sign read 50 cents a night. Clara stood on the boardwalk across the street, her hand in her pocket, fingers pressed against the coins she already knew weren't enough. 43 cents? She turned away before anyone could see her counting. The eatery had closed an hour ago. The street was empty now. The storefronts dark, the only light a thin sliver of moon behind clouds. Clara walked with no direction, her boots scuffing against packed dirt, the canvas bag bumping against her hip. The livery stable sat at the edge of town. The wide doors hung open, and the smell of horses and hay drifted out into the cool night air. Clara stopped, looked around. No one. She slipped inside. The stable was warm with animal heat. 3 horses stood in their stalls, one flicking its tail at a fly, another already dozing with its head low. Hay bales were stacked against the back wall, piled high enough to hide behind. Clara climbed over the lowest bale and dropped down into the corner. The hay was dry and scratchy, but it held warmth. She pulled her carpet bag against her chest, curled her knees up, and pressed her back against the wooden wall. The smell of dust and manure and dried grass filled her nose, not so different from the barn back home, before the bank came, before everything fell apart. She closed her eyes. Sleep came in fragments, thin and restless, broken by the shuffle of hooves and the distant bark of a dog. Every time she drifted, her body jerked awake, her hand tightening on the bag like someone might take it in the dark. The first light came gray and cold through the cracks in the stable walls. Footsteps, boot heels on packed dirt. Clara's eyes snapped open. She pushed herself up on one elbow, hay sticking to her hair, her dress, her hands. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the morning light behind her. Mrs. Ida Holloway. Arms crossed, face unreadable. Clara scrambled to her feet. Her cheeks burned. Hay fell from her skirt as she tried to brush it away, tried to straighten herself into something that didn't look like what she was, a woman who had slept with the horses because she couldn't afford a bed. Figured you'd end up here. Mrs. Ida's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Saw you counting those coins last night. Did the math myself. Clara's throat closed. She couldn't speak. Mrs. Ida stepped into the stable. The morning light caught the gray in her hair, the deep lines around her mouth. She looked at Clara the way a farmer looks at a horse before buying, measuring, assessing, deciding. I need someone to wash dishes and peel potatoes, she said. $3 a week, meals included. There's a cot in the storeroom. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and a lock on the door. Sundays off. She paused. You interested? Or you planning to sleep with the horses again? Clara's pride rose in her chest like a fist. She could say no. She could walk out of this town the same way she walked in. Find another stagecoach, another place, another window to stand outside of. But then she thought of the cornbread, the way Ethan had pushed it across the table without asking. The chair he pulled out. I can work, Clara said. Her voice came out rough, but steady. Mrs. Ida studied her for a long moment. Then she turned toward the stable door. We'll see. Come on, then. Biscuits don't make themselves. Clara grabbed her bag and followed. The eatery kitchen was small and hot. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, already radiating heat from the fire Mrs. Ida had started before dawn. Pots hung from hooks above a scarred wooden counter. A bucket of water sat by the back door, and beside it, a mountain of potatoes in a burlap sack. Mrs. Ida pointed at the potatoes. "Peel those. All of them. Skins go in the bucket by the door. I use them for the pigs. Peeled ones go in the pot." She handed Clara a knife with a wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. Clara took it, sat down on the stool by the counter, picked up the first potato. Her hands remembered the motion before her mind caught up. Peel, turn, peel, turn. The skin curled away in long ribbons. The potato underneath was pale and firm. She reached for the next one. Mrs. Ida moved around the kitchen, stoking the fire, measuring flour, cracking eggs into a bowl. She didn't watch Clara directly, but Clara could feel her attention. The way you feel someone's eyes on your back even when they're looking somewhere else. The pile of peeled potatoes grew. Clara's hands ached. Her fingers cramped from gripping the knife. But she didn't stop. Peel, turn, peel, turn. The rhythm was its own kind of prayer. When the last potato dropped into the pot, Clara set the knife down. Her hands were raw, her shoulders stiff. Mrs. Ida walked over, looked at the pot, looked at Clara. "You'll do," she said, 2 words. 2. That was all. But something in Clara's chest loosened a knot she hadn't known was there. Mrs. Ida pointed toward a doorway covered by a muslin curtain. "Storerooms through there. Cots in the corner. Get yourself cleaned up. Breakfast rush starts in an hour." Clara pushed through the curtain. The storeroom was small shelves lined with jars and sacks. A narrow cot pushed against the wall. A wash basin on a wooden stand. A single window let in the morning light. She set her carpet bag on the cot, looked around the tiny space. 4 walls. A door she could close, a place that was hers. At least for now. She sat down on the edge of the cot. The mattress was thin, stuffed with corn husks that rustled when she moved. But it was a bed. A real bed. Through the curtain, she heard Mrs. Ida's voice calling out the first customers arriving, the bell above the door jingling, the scrape of chairs on the wooden floor. Clara stood, smoothed her dress, took a breath. She pushed through the curtain and walked into the kitchen. The breakfast rush hit like a wave plates to carry, coffee to pour, dishes piling in the basin faster than she could wash them. Clara moved without thinking, her body doing what bodies do when there's no time for anything else. By mid-morning, her arms ached, her feet throbbed, sweat stuck her dress to her back, but she was still standing. Mrs. Ida passed by with a tray of biscuits, paused just long enough to say, "Sunday's off. Starting this week? Don't be late Monday?" Clara nodded, picked up another stack of dirty plates. Through the front window, she saw a man on horseback ride past. For just a moment, she thought she recognized the leather vest, the way he sat easy in the saddle. Ethan Callahan. He didn't look toward the eatery, didn't slow down. But Clara's hands stopped moving, a plate still dripping in her grip. She wondered if he knew she was still here, if he'd come back. And if he did, what then? The flour bin sat against the kitchen wall, a burlap sack with faded black letters stenciled on the side. Clara plunged her hands in before dawn, the powder cool and soft between her fingers. 3 weeks now. She knew the routine the way her body knew breathing. Up before the sun touched the horizon, stoke the fire in the cast iron stove until the metal glowed. Measure flour, cut in lard. Add buttermilk until the dough came together, not too wet, not too dry. Mrs. Ida had shown her once, only once. You either got the feel for it or you don't, she'd said. Can't teach hands what they already know? Clara's hands knew. She turned the dough onto the floured counter, pressed it flat with her palms, folded it over, pressed again. The motion was her mother's. She'd learned it standing on a stool in a kitchen 1,000 miles from here. Flour dusting her nose, her mother's voice soft in her ear. Don't work it too much. Biscuits need a gentle touch. For one breath, Clara wasn't a widow in a strange town. She was just a woman making bread. The bell above the front door jingled. First customer of the day. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed the coffee pot from the stove, and pushed through the kitchen doorway. Mr. Beeman sat at his usual table by the window, 80, if he was a day, with a face like worn leather and hands that trembled when he lifted his cup. He came every morning, same time, same order coffee, 2 eggs, biscuits with butter. Morning, Mr. Beeman? He nodded. Didn't say much. Never did. Clara poured his coffee, the steam rising between them. He wrapped both hands around the cup like he was holding something precious. She went back to the kitchen, cut out the biscuits with a tin cutter, laid them on the baking sheet, slid them into the oven. The heat pressed against her face, dry and sharp. By the time the breakfast rush hit, Clara's arms ached and sweat stuck her dress to her back. She moved between tables with plates balanced on her forearms, refilling coffee, clearing dishes, answering questions with as few words as possible. Yes, ma'am, the stew's fresh. No, sir, we're out of apple pie, got peach. More coffee coming right up. She kept to herself, smiled when required, answered when spoken to, nothing more. The faces blurred together, ranchers in dusty boots, women in calico dresses, children who kicked their legs under the table and spilled milk on the checkered oilcloth. Clara learned their orders, but not their names. It was easier that way. Easier not to belong to anything she might have to leave. Evenings were quieter. The supper crowd thinned by 7, and by 8, only a few tables stayed occupied. Clara washed dishes in the basin by the back door, her hands red and wrinkled, soap stinging the cracks in her knuckles. The bell jingled. She didn't need to look. She knew the sound of his boots by now. Ethan Callahan took the same table every time, the one by the window where he'd sat that first night. Mrs. Ida had mentioned once that he'd been coming here for years. Always that table, always alone. Same order, stew, cornbread, black coffee. Clara dried her hands on her apron, poured coffee into a tin cup, and carried it to his table. He looked up, nodded. She nodded back. That was all. That was enough. She went back to the dishes, but she could feel him there, the way you feel heat from a stove even with your back turned. Not watching her exactly, just present. 3rd week. The evening crowd had cleared out, and Ethan sat alone with an empty plate and a half-drunk cup of coffee. Clara approached with the pot. More. He pushed the cup toward her. She filled it. Biscuits are better than last week, he said. Clara's hand paused on the pot handle. She looked at him, really looked for the first time since that first night. His face was weathered, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. a small scar on his chin, old and faded. He wasn't handsome the way men in books were handsome, but there was something steady in him, like a fence post that had weathered 100 storms and was still standing. "Mrs. Ida's recipe," she said. "Your hands, though—" She didn't know what to do with that. The words sat between them, unexpected and warm. She refilled his coffee again, even though the cup was already full, and walked back to the kitchen without saying anything else. That night, in the storeroom, Clara sat on the edge of her cot and counted the coins in the tin box she kept under the mattress. $3 from the first week, 3 more from the second, $6 total, enough for a stagecoach ticket, enough to run. She put the coins back in the tin, slid it under the mattress, lay down, and stared at the ceiling until sleep came. Morning, the flour bin, the dough, the rhythm. Mr. Beeman arrived at his usual time, settled into his usual chair. Clara brought his coffee, his eggs, his biscuits. He cut into the biscuit with his fork, took a bite, chewed slow, the way old men do when they're tasting something more than food. He set down his fork. "My Ethel used to make 'em just like this." Clara paused, the coffee pot in her hand. 37 years of marriage. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. "And I still miss her biscuits most." He looked out the window, at something Clara couldn't see. "Guess I miss her hands making 'em." Clara's vision blurred. She turned toward the window, pretended to check the weather. The street outside was empty, the morning sun slanting across the dirt. But she didn't see any of it. She blinked hard, swallowed. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Beeman?" He shook his head, picked up his fork again. Clara walked back to the kitchen, set the coffee pot on the stove, pressed her palms flat against the counter, and breathed. Mrs. Ida came in through the back door, arms full of eggs from the hen house. "You all right?" "Fine." Clara's voice came out steady, almost. Mrs. Ida set the eggs on the counter, looked at Clara the way she always did, measuring, weighing. But she didn't push. "Potatoes need peeling," she said. "Sacks by the door." Clara nodded, grabbed the knife, sat down on the stool. Peel, turn, peel, turn. The rhythm was its own kind of answer. That evening, Ethan came in later than usual. The supper crowd had already gone, and Mrs. Ida was wiping down tables in the front room. Clara was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the last pot. When she heard the bell, she dried her hands, walked out. He stood just inside the door, hat in his hands. He wasn't looking at the tables. He was looking at her. "Figured you'd still be here," he said. "Where else would I be?" He didn't answer. Just stood there, turning his hat brim in his fingers, like he was working up to something. "Sunday's your day off," he said finally. "That right?" Clara nodded. "Mrs. Ida's orders?" "I got a check on a mare out at Harmon's place. Thought maybe you'd want to walk out there. Get some air." He paused. "If you want?" Clara's hands were still damp from the dishwater. She could feel Mrs. Ida watching from somewhere behind her, pretending not to listen. She should say no. She should go back to the kitchen, finish the pots, crawl into her cot, and stay where it was safe. But she thought of the biscuits, the chair he'd pulled out, the cornbread he'd pushed across the table without asking. "All right," she said. "Sunday." Ethan nodded once, put his hat back on, walked out without another word. The bell jingled behind him. Clara stood in the empty eatery, her heart beating harder than it should. She didn't know what Sunday would bring, but for the first time in months, she wanted to find out. Sunday morning came too quiet. Clara woke before dawn out of habit, her body already swinging her legs off the cot before her mind caught up. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress, corn husks rustling beneath her, and listened. No clatter of pots, no hiss of the stove, no Mrs. Ida calling out orders from the kitchen. Silence. She dressed anyway, washed her face in the basin, the water cold against her skin, pinned her hair back with the same 3 pins she'd carried from Missouri, smoothed her dress the same brown calico she'd worn every day since arriving, washed twice a week in the basin, and hung to dry over the storeroom chair. The eatery was empty. Mrs. Ida had gone to church, then to visit her sister 3 miles out of town. She wouldn't be back until evening. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway. The stove was cold. The counter was clean. The flour bin sat untouched against the wall. She didn't know what to do with her hands. For 3 weeks, every hour had been accounted for. Wake, work, sleep. The rhythm had filled the spaces where thinking might have crept in. But now the spaces were wide open, and Clara could feel them pressing against her chest. She walked out the back door. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of sage and dust and something faintly sweet, probably the wild asters blooming along the creek bed south of town. Clara walked without direction, her boots crunching on the packed dirt road, her arms wrapped around herself even though she wasn't cold. She passed the general store, closed for Sunday, the blacksmith's forge, silent and dark. The livery stable where she'd spent that first night curled in the hay like a stray dog. At the edge of town, the road turned to open land. Brown grass stretched toward the horizon, broken only by the dark shapes of mesquite trees and the thin line of a fence running parallel to the road. Clara stopped, stood there looking at nothing. "You just gonna stand there all day?" She turned. Ethan sat on a bay horse a few yards behind her, reins loose in one hand. He wore the same leather vest, the same worn boots. His work gloves were tucked into his belt. "Didn't hear you coming," Clara said. "Horse walks quiet." He shifted in the saddle, nodded toward the road ahead. "I'm heading out to Harmon's place. Got a mare needs checking on." He paused. "Walk'll do you good. If you want." Clara looked back at the town behind her. The eatery, the storeroom, the cot that was starting to feel like hers. She looked at Ethan. "All right." He didn't smile, but something in his face eased. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward at a walk. Clara fell into step beside them, the horse's hooves thudding soft against the dirt. They didn't talk. The silence sat between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just present. Harmon Ranch spread across a shallow valley about a mile from town. A modest house with a wooden porch, a barn with a sagging roof, a corral where 6 horses milled in the morning sun. An older man in a straw hat raised his hand from the porch as they approached. A woman beside him, his wife. Clara guessed nodded and went back inside. Ethan dismounted, tied his horse to the fence rail, and walked toward the corral. Clara followed. The horses scattered as they approached, all except one. A bay mare with a white blaze on her forehead stood in the far corner, ears flat, eyes rolling. She paced along the fence line, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, like she was trapped in a space only she could see. "She lost her foal last month," Ethan said. His voice was low, like he was talking to himself as much as to Clara. "Still skittish. Won't let anyone near her." He climbed over the fence. Slow, no sudden movements. The mare's head came up. Her nostrils flared. Ethan stood still. Didn't reach for her. Didn't move toward her. Just stood in the middle of the corral with his arms loose at his sides. His weight settled. His eyes on the ground a few feet in front of him. The mare circled. Once. Twice. Her hooves kicked up dust that hung in the still air. Ethan didn't move. Clara gripped the fence rail, the wood rough under her palms. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, though she couldn't have said why. The mare slowed, stopped. Her ears came forward, just slightly. Ethan still didn't move. The mare took 1 step toward him, then another. She stretched her neck out, nostrils working, and nosed his shoulder. Ethan's hand came up slow, so slow, and rested on her neck. He didn't pat her, didn't grip, just let his hand sit there, warm and steady. The mare let out a long breath. Her head dropped. Clara's throat tightened. She turned away, looked out at the brown grass and the empty sky, and waited for the feeling to pass. When she turned back, Ethan was climbing out of the corral. He brushed the dust off his vest, didn't look at her directly. "She'll be all right," he said. "Just needs time." They walked back toward town. The sun was higher now, the air warming, and Clara could feel sweat prickling along her hairline. "You got people somewhere?" Ethan asked. His voice was casual, like he was asking about the weather. "Family." Clara watched her boots move against the dirt. Left, right, left, right. "Had a husband?" she said. "House too. Both gone now." She waited for the questions. How did he die? What happened to the house? Where are you from? The questions everyone asked. Sooner or later, Ethan didn't ask. "I had a brother," he said. "Fever took him when I was 19. He adjusted his hat, squinting at the road ahead. "Some things just end." "Don't mean you did." Clara's step faltered. She caught herself, kept walking. No one had ever said that to her before. Not the neighbors who'd watched the bank take her house. Not the minister who'd stood over her husband's grave and talked about God's plan. Not anyone. "Some things just end." "Don't mean you did." She turned the words over in her mind like stones, feeling their weight. They walked the rest of the way without speaking. But the silence was different now. Lighter. Somehow, like a door that had been locked was cracked open. Just enough to let the air through. At the edge of town, Ethan stopped. "I'll be back this way Thursday," he said. "Harmon needs a fence mended. Might stop in for supper after." Clara nodded. "I'll save you some cornbread." Something flickered in his face, not quite a smile, but close. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the ranch without looking back. Clara stood there for a moment, watching until he disappeared over the rise. Then she walked back to the eatery, let herself in through the back door, sat down on the edge of her cot, and looked at the canvas bag in the corner. The same bag she'd clutched against her chest that first night. The only thing she'd carried from her old life. She hadn't opened it since she arrived. Hadn't wanted to see what was inside. But now her hand reached for it, pulled it onto her lap. Her fingers found the brass clasp, cold and familiar. She opened the bag. Inside, folded beneath her spare stockings and her mother's handkerchief, was the letter. The one her husband had left on the kitchen table the day he died. The one she'd never shown anyone. Clara pulled it out. The paper was soft from handling, the edges worn. She didn't read it. She already knew every word. But holding it, she thought of Ethan's voice. Some things just end. She thought of the mare, circling in the corral, skittish, scared, waiting for someone patient enough to stand still. And she thought of the man who'd asked about her at the stagecoach office back in Missouri, the one her neighbor had mentioned in a letter that arrived the week before Clara left. A man with a ledger, asking questions about debts. Clara folded the letter, put it back in the bag. She told herself he wouldn't find her here. She told herself she was safe, but her hands were shaking. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday morning. Clara heard it before she saw it. The rattle of wheels, the snort of horses, the driver's voice calling out commands. She was in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, scrubbing the breakfast plates while Mrs. Ida counted the morning's take at the front counter. The bell above the door jingled. Clara didn't look up. Customers came and went. Nothing unusual about a stagecoach passenger wanting coffee after a long ride. She heard Mrs. Ida's voice, flat and businesslike. "Coffee's fresh. Biscuits, too, if you want 'em." A man's voice, city accent, clipped and precise. Just coffee, and perhaps some information. Clara's hands slowed in the water. She didn't know why. Something in the voice too smooth, too careful. "Information about what?" Mrs. Ida asked. "I'm looking for a woman." Clara's fingers tightened on the plate she was holding. "A widow," the man continued. "Would have come through in the last month or so. Traveling alone from Missouri. Bought a ticket to the end of the line that's here. I'm told." The plate slipped. Clara grabbed for it, caught it, set it in the basin with hands that weren't quite steady. "Lots of folks pass through," Mrs. Ida said. Her voice hadn't changed, same flat tone, same disinterest. "Can't say I keep track. She owes a debt, $47, her late husband's account, left unpaid when he passed. Her name was on the note." A pause. The sound of something being set on the counter, a card. Maybe. "My name is Virgil Crane. I represent the creditor. If you hear anything at all, there's a reward for information." Clara's hands had stopped moving. The dishwater was cooling around her wrists. She stared at the window above the basin, at the slice of blue sky visible through the glass, and tried to make her lungs work. $47. She'd known about the debts, found out the day after the funeral, when the man from the bank had appeared at her door with a ledger and a face like stone. Her husband had borrowed against the house, against the farm equipment, against everything. By the time the accounts were settled, there was nothing left. Nothing but the clothes on her back and a canvas bag and 43 cents. She'd thought she'd escaped it, thought the debts would stay buried in Missouri with everything else. But here was Virgil Crane, with his city accent and his ledger and his reward for information. The bell jingled again. Footsteps on the boardwalk, fading. Clara waited, counted to 10. Then she walked to the kitchen doorway and looked out. Mrs. Ida stood at the counter, holding a small white card between her fingers. She looked at Clara. Neither of them spoke. Mrs. Ida set the card down on the counter, face up. Clara could see the printed name from where she stood. Virgil Crane. Collections. "Man staying at the boarding house," Mrs. Ida said. "Says he'll be in town a few days. Asking around." Clara's throat was too tight to speak. Mrs. Ida picked up her rag and started wiping down the counter, same as always. "Finish those dishes. Lunch crowd'll be here in an hour." Clara went back to the basin. Her hands moved without her scrub. Rinse, stack, repeat. The motions were automatic now, worn into her muscles over 4 weeks of work. But her mind was somewhere else. Missouri. The house she'd lived in for 6 years. The kitchen where she'd made biscuits every morning. The bed where her husband had died, coughing blood into a handkerchief. Apologizing for something he wouldn't name. She'd found out what he was apologizing for 3 days later, when the bank came. The lunch crowd arrived. Clara served, poured, cleared, smiled when required. Her face felt like a mask, stiff and unfamiliar. Mr. Beeman came in at his usual time, ordered his usual meal, told Clara her biscuits were still the best in town. She thanked him. Her voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. Ethan didn't come for supper. Clara told herself it didn't matter. He'd said Thursday. This was Tuesday. No reason to expect him. But she kept glancing at the door anyway. By closing time, Mrs. Ida had wiped down the last table and hung her apron on the hook by the kitchen door. "That man," she said, not looking at Clara. "He's asking about you." Clara's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. "I know. You gonna tell me about it?" The words stuck in Clara's throat. She thought of the mare at Harmon's ranch circling, skittish, ears flat against her skull, afraid to let anyone close. "My husband left debts," she said finally. "I didn't know about them until after he died. The house, the farm, all of it went to pay what he owed. But there was still $47 left over. A man he'd borrowed from. I didn't have it, so I left." Mrs. Ida nodded slowly. "And now the man's here to collect." "Yes." Silence. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. "What are you going to do?" Mrs. Ida asked. Clara didn't have an answer. That night, she sat on the edge of her cot in the storeroom. The door was closed. The muslin curtain hung still in the air. No breeze to move it. She pulled the tin box from under the mattress, opened it, counted the coins inside, $9, 4 weeks of work, 4 weeks of biscuits and dishes and coffee, and standing on her feet until her legs ached. $9. The stagecoach ticket to Tucson cost $7. She'd have $2 left over. Enough for a few meals. Enough to start over somewhere else. Again. She could be gone before dawn, before Crane asked enough questions to find her. Before Mrs. Ida had to lie for her. Before anyone else got tangled up in her mess. Clara pulled her canvas bag from the corner, opened it, started folding her spare dress, her stockings, her mother's handkerchief. Her hands stopped. The apron hung on a nail by the cot. White cotton, stained with flour and grease, the strings frayed from being tied and untied 100 times. Mrs. Ida had given it to her the first morning. "Can't have you dripping on the customers." Clara looked at it. She looked at the cot, the thin mattress, the corn husk stuffing that rustled when she moved, the wool blanket folded at the foot, the window above. where she could see a slice of the street. The shelf where she'd put her hairpins and her mother's handkerchief and the small mirror Mrs. Ida had lent her. 4 weeks. That's all it had been. 4 weeks of work and wages and a cot in a storeroom. But it was hers. Clara stood, walked to the door, put her hand on the wooden frame, 3 steps to the back door, out into the alley, down to the livery stable. She could hire a horse, ride to the next town, catch a different stage, be gone before the sun came up. She could run. She was good at running. Her hand didn't move. Behind her, the apron hung on its nail. The cot waited with its thin blanket. The window showed a sky full of stars she'd started to recognize. Clara stood there, caught between the door and everything behind her. She didn't leave, but she didn't unpack her bag either. She set it by the cot, still full, still ready. Lay down on the mattress with her dress still on, her boots still laced. Sleep didn't come. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence and waited for the morning. And in the morning, Virgil Crane would still be here, asking questions, getting closer. Clara dropped another plate. The ceramic hit the floor and shattered into a dozen pieces, white shards scattering across the kitchen boards. She stood there, staring at the mess, her hands still held out in front of her like they belonged to someone else. This was the 3rd one this week. "Clara?" Mrs. Ida's voice came from the doorway. "Storeroom? Now?" Clara grabbed the broom, started sweeping the broken pieces into a pile. Her hands were shaking. They hadn't stopped shaking since Tuesday. "Leave it." Mrs. Ida's voice was flat. "I said now." Clara set the broom against the wall and followed Mrs. Ida through the muslin curtain into the storeroom. The older woman closed the curtain behind them and stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "You gonna tell me what's going on, or you gonna break every plate I own?" Clara's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "That man," Mrs. Ida said. "Crane? He came back this morning, asked more questions, described you pretty good brown hair, brown dress, came in on the stage about a month ago." Her eyes were hard, measuring. "Said your name is Clara Weston. Said you owe $47. Said you ran." Clara's knees went soft. She reached for the shelf beside her, gripped it to keep herself upright. "Is it true?" Clara couldn't look at her. She stared at the floor, at the worn boards, at a crack that ran from under the cot to the corner of the room. "Yes." The word came out small, pathetic. "My husband died 6 months ago." Her voice cracked, and she hated it. "I didn't know about the debts, not until after the funeral. When the bank came, he'd borrowed against everything: the house, the equipment, the land, all of it. By the time they were done, there was nothing left." She swallowed. "Except the $47 he owed to a man in town. A private loan. My name was on the note, too. I didn't have it. So I left. I took what I could carry and I bought a ticket to the end of the line and I ran." Silence. Clara could hear her own breathing, ragged and uneven. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have told you. I should have—" Her voice broke. "I'll go, tonight, before he finds out I'm here, before it causes you any trouble." She waited for Mrs. Ida to agree, to tell her to pack her bag and get out. It was what she deserved. Mrs. Ida didn't move. "My first husband drank himself to death," she said. Clara looked up. Mrs. Ida's face hadn't changed, still hard, still measuring, but something in her voice had shifted. Lower, rougher. Spent every penny we had on whiskey and cards. By the time they put him in the ground, I owed the general store 2 years' worth of credit. 2 years? I scrubbed floors in every house in this town until my knuckles bled to pay it off. Took me 3 years to pay it off. She paused. Didn't make me less. Made me more. Clara's throat tightened. She couldn't speak. You think you're the first woman to carry a man's mistakes? Mrs. Ida shook her head. You won't be the last either. That's just how it is. But if Crane finds out I'm here, then we deal with it. Mrs. Ida's voice was firm. You work for me. You pay your way. That's more than most can say. Clara's eyes burned. She pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to hold it in. Now, Mrs. Ida pulled back the curtain. We got a supper crowd coming. Wash your face and get back to work. Clara nodded. Couldn't do anything else. The supper crowd came and went. Clara moved through the motions plates. Coffee, dishes, but her body felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside and left only the shell. Ethan didn't come. By the time the last customer left and Mrs. Ida had locked the front door, Clara's legs were trembling. She took the garbage pail out the back door, potato peels, bones, scraps, and walked toward the waste pit at the edge of the alley. The ground was uneven back here, rutted from wagon wheels, soft in patches from the rain that had fallen 2 nights ago. Clara didn't see the hole. Her boot caught on something, a root, a stone. She never knew, and then she was falling. The pail flew from her hands. Her palms hit the ground first, then her knees, and then she was face down in the mud behind the eatery. Garbage scattered around her. The smell of rotting food filling her nose. She pushed herself up. Her dress was soaked through, brown muck clinging to the front. Her hands were black with it. She could feel it on her face, cold and gritty against her cheek. She tried to stand. Her boot slipped. She went down again. Harder this time. Her hip hitting a rock, hidden beneath the mud. The pain shot through her, sharp and bright, and something broke. Not her bone. Something else. Something inside. Clara stayed on her knees in the mud. Didn't try to get up again. Her head dropped forward, her chin against her chest, her hands pressed flat in the muck like she was praying. She thought of the house in Missouri, the kitchen table where she'd eaten breakfast every morning for 6 years, the bed where her husband had died, the front porch where she'd stood and watched strangers carry out her furniture, one piece at a time. She thought of the stagecoach, the canvas bag, 43 cents. She thought of Virgil Crane and his ledger and his reward for information. $47? She'd run 1,000 miles to escape $47. And now here she was, on her knees in the mud behind an eatery in a town she'd never heard of a month ago, covered in garbage. Too tired to stand. Her mother used to say that pride goeth before a fall. She'd never mentioned what came after. Clara didn't know how long she stayed there. The cold seeped through her dress, through her skin, into her bones. Her hands went numb. Her knees ached against the hard ground beneath the mud. Footsteps. She didn't look up, couldn't. The footsteps stopped a few feet away. Clara. Ethan's voice. Quiet. Not surprised, not shocked, not pitying. Just her name. She still didn't look up. She couldn't let him see her like this, covered in mud and garbage, kneeling in the dirt like a beggar, like nothing. Go away." Her voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. "Please." He didn't go away. She heard him move, felt him settle onto the back steps of the eatery, a few feet from where she knelt. Close enough to matter, not close enough to touch. He didn't say anything. Clara's shoulders started to shake. She pressed her hands harder into the mud, trying to hold herself together, but it wasn't working. The sobs came up from somewhere deep, ugly and ragged, and she couldn't stop them. She cried into the mud behind Holloway's eatery while Ethan Callahan sat on the back steps and didn't look away. When the sobs finally stopped, Clara's throat was raw and her eyes were swollen and her whole body ached like she'd been beaten. Ethan still hadn't moved. "That man," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "He's here for me." "I figured. I owe $47. My husband's debt. My name was on the note. I ran." She laughed, but it came out wrong, bitter, broken. "I should leave. Before it gets worse. Before it hurts anyone else." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "You could..." A pause. "Or you could stay and see what happens. What if staying makes it worse for everyone? What if leaving does..." Clara finally looked up. Ethan sat on the steps with his elbows on his knees, a small leather pouch in his hands. He was turning it over and over, running his thumb along the stitching. Something about the motion was familiar, old, practiced. A habit. "What's that?" she asked. He glanced down at the pouch. "My brother's. He used to keep his tobacco in it. I don't smoke, just..." He shrugged. "Can't seem to let it go. Some things just end. Don't mean you did." Clara looked at the pouch, looked at Ethan, looked at the mud on her hands and her dress and her face. She didn't deserve this. Didn't deserve him sitting here, not saying the right thing, just being present. Didn't deserve Mrs. Ida keeping her secret. Didn't deserve any of it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe deserving had nothing to do with it. "I don't know how to stay," she said. "I've been running so long I don't know how to stop." Ethan looked at her. Really looked. The way he had that first night through the eatery window. "So stay put," he said. "See what happens." He stood, offered her his hand. Clara took it. He pulled her up out of the mud, and she stood there in the dark behind the eatery, covered in filth. Her heart cracked open like a broken plate. But she was standing, and tomorrow, Virgil Crane would come looking for his $47. Morning rush. Every table full. Clara moved between them with the coffee pot. Her hands steady now. Her dress clean. Her hair pinned back the way Mrs. Ida had shown her. The smell of biscuits and bacon filled the air. Forks scraped against tin plates. Someone laughed at something the postmaster said. Normal. Everything was normal. Clara refilled Mr. Beeman's cup. He nodded his thanks, went back to his eggs. The Harmon family sat by the window. Mr. Harmon, his wife, their two boys kicking their legs under the table. A rancher Clara didn't know by name but recognized by his worn boots had ordered the stew. The bell above the door jingled. Clara looked up. Virgil Crane stood in the doorway. He wore the same city clothes, the bowler hat, the pressed suit, the leather satchel over his shoulder. His eyes swept the room once, twice, and then they found Clara. He smiled. Clara's hand tightened on the coffee pot handle. The metal was hot against her palm, almost burning. But she didn't set it down, didn't look away. Crane walked toward the counter. His shoes clicked against the wooden floor, sharp and precise, each step deliberate. The conversation in the room didn't stop, not yet, but Clara could feel the shift, heads turning, forks pausing mid-bite. He stopped at the counter, set his satchel down, pulled out a leather ledger and laid it flat, open to a page covered in neat columns of numbers. "Mrs. Clara Weston," he said. His voice carried meant to carry. "I've been patient, very patient, but the debt is $47, and my employer has waited long enough." The room went quiet. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the sweat prickling along her hairline, the tremble starting in her fingers. The coffee pot was still in her hand. She set it down on the counter, carefully, so he wouldn't see her shake. "Pay what you owe," Crane said. "Or I take this matter to the sheriff. Debtors can be held, until arrangements are made." Clara's throat was dry. She tried to swallow, couldn't. Every eye in the room was on her. Mr. Beeman, his fork halfway to his mouth. The Harmons, frozen at their table. The rancher with the worn boots. Mrs. Ida, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands. "Run." The words screamed in Clara's head. The back door was 10 steps away. She could be through it before anyone moved. Down the alley, to the livery stable, on a horse heading anywhere but here. Her legs didn't move. She thought of the mud, the garbage, kneeling in the filth behind the eatery, too broken to stand. Ethan's hand, reaching down. So stay put. See what happens. Clara opened her mouth. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have $18. Crane's smile didn't waver. "That's not what you owe. It's what I have." She reached under the counter, pulled out the tin box she'd been keeping there since yesterday. Her savings. 6 weeks of work, plus the tips customers had started leaving once they learned her name. $18. It's all of it. She opened the box, counted out the coins and the worn bills onto the counter, one by one. The sound of metal on wood was loud in the silent room. Crane looked at the money. His smile tightened at the edges. "Mrs. Weston, you seem to misunderstand. The debt is $47, not $18. Your husband signed for it. Your name is on the note right beside his." He tapped the ledger. "A legal obligation doesn't disappear because you don't have the money. That's not how the world works." Clara's hands were flat on the counter. She could feel the grain of the wood, the slight unevenness where years of use had worn it smooth in some places and rough in others. "Then take me to the sheriff," she said. The words surprised her. They surprised Crane too. His smile faltered, just for a second. "I'll tell him what I just told you," Clara continued. $18. That's everything I have. If that's not enough, then do what you have to do." She didn't look away from his face, didn't blink. Crane's jaw tightened. He glanced around the room at the faces watching him, at the stillness that had settled over every table. Mr. Beeman's voice, rough and slow. He hadn't moved from his table, his fork still in his hand. But his eyes were on Crane. "I've eaten breakfast here every day for 6 years, the old man said. "This woman makes the best biscuits west of the Mississippi. Whatever she owes, I figure she's earning it back honest." He paused. "That count for nothing where you come from." Crane's mouth opened. closed. Mrs. Ida stepped out of the kitchen doorway. Her arms were crossed, her face hard. "She works for me," she said. "Pays her way, shows up before dawn, stays after closing. That's more than I can say for most folks who pass through this town." The Harmon family hadn't moved. But Mr. Harmon's hand was resting on the table now, palm down, like he was ready to stand if he needed to. His wife's chin was lifted, her eyes steady on Crane's face. The rancher in the worn boots set down his spoon. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. No one left. No one looked away. Clara stood behind the counter with her $18 spread out in front of her. And she felt something shift. Not in the room, in herself. She had expected them to watch her fail, to see her humiliated, dragged out, exposed as the woman who ran from her debts. She had expected to face Crane alone. But they weren't saving her. They weren't offering to pay her debt or fight her battle or make it all go away. They were just staying. And that was enough. The back door opened. Footsteps. Clara didn't turn. But she knew the sound of those boots. Ethan walked through the kitchen, past Mrs. Ida, and stopped by the doorway that led to the main room. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, face expressionless. He didn't say a word, but Crane saw him, saw the way he stood, not threatening, not aggressive, just present, filling the space, blocking the only other exit. Crane looked around the room one more time, counted the faces, calculated the odds. $18, he said finally. His voice was flat now, all the smoothness gone. "And I don't come back." Clara nodded. $18, and you don't come back? Crane reached out and swept the coins and the bills into his hand, counted them, tucked them into his vest pocket. He closed the ledger, put it back in his satchel, straightened his hat. "Mrs. Weston," he said, "you're lucky you have friends." Clara didn't flinch. "I know." Crane turned and walked toward the door. His shoes clicked against the floor, the same sharp, precise sound as before, but faster now, harder. The bell jingled as he pushed through. Clara watched through the window as he crossed the street, climbed into the waiting stagecoach, and disappeared. The room let out a breath. Mr. Beeman picked up his fork again, took a bite of his eggs like nothing had happened. The Harmon's boys started kicking their legs under the table. Someone asked for more coffee. Mrs. Ida walked over to Clara, stood beside her at the counter. "You all right?" Clara looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter, watched the trembling slow, then stop. "I gave him everything," she said. Her voice sounded strange, thin, and far away. "Everything I saved, I'm back to nothing." Mrs. Ida was quiet for a moment. "You're not back to nothing," she said. "You still got a job, still got a cot, still got a town full of people who just watched you stand your ground." Clara looked up at her. Mrs. Ida's face was the same as always, hard, measuring, unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something warm. "Now..." Mrs. Ida picked up the coffee pot and pushed it into Clara's hands. "Breakfast rush isn't over. Mr. Beeman's cup is empty." Clara took the pot. Her hands were still trembling, but they held. She walked to Mr. Beeman's table, filled his cup, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Dust Creek, she smiled without having to make herself do it. At the doorway to the kitchen, Ethan still stood with his arms crossed. He caught her eye as she passed. He nodded. Once. Slow. Clara nodded back. That was enough. The morning went on. Customers came and went. Clara served and cleared and washed and served again. The rhythm as familiar now as her own heartbeat. By the time the lunch crowd thinned, her legs were aching and her arms were sore, and she'd never felt so tired in her life. But she was still here. She was still standing. And somewhere, on a stagecoach heading east, Virgil Crane was carrying away $18 that used to be hers. But he wasn't carrying away anything else. That evening, after the eatery closed and Mrs. Ida had gone home, Clara sat on the back steps and watched the sun set behind the hills. The sky turned orange, then pink, then a deep purple that faded into stars. Ethan found her there, sat down beside her, the same way he had the night before. "Heard you stood up to him," he said. "Didn't have much choice. Always got a choice." He pulled out the leather tobacco pouch, turned it over in his hands. "You could have run. You didn't." Clara looked at the sky. The first stars were coming out, faint pinpricks of light in the growing dark. "I'm tired of running," she said. "Figured it was time to see what happens when you stay." Ethan didn't respond. They sat in silence, watching the dark settle over the town. After a while, he stood, put the pouch back in his pocket, looked down at her. "Sunday supper," he said. "Mrs. Ida's doing a roast. The Harmons will be there. Mr. Beeman, too, probably." Clara looked up at him. "Is that an invitation? If you want it to be?" She thought about it. The eatery, the table by the window, the chair Ethan had pulled out that first night. "All right," she said. "Sunday." He tipped his hat, walked away into the dark. Clara stayed on the steps a while longer, watching the stars multiply across the sky. Sunday. 3 days away. 3 days to figure out what belonging felt like. Sunday came quiet. Clara woke before dawn out of habit, her body already swinging toward the edge of the cot before she remembered. No work today, no biscuits to make, no coffee to pour, no dishes piling in the basin. She lay back down, stared at the ceiling. 1 week since Crane left. 7 days of the same routine: wake, work, sleep. But something had shifted. The rhythm felt different now, lighter. Somehow, like a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there had finally been set down. Clara got up anyway, washed her face in the basin, pinned her hair, put on her brown calico dress, the same one she'd worn every day since Missouri, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft. She walked out the back door. The morning air was cool, carrying the smell of sage and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that caught the first light of the sun. Clara walked to the edge of town, stood at the same spot where she'd stood that first Sunday, looking out at the brown grass and the distant hills. But it didn't feel the same. That first Sunday, she'd been standing at the edge of something she didn't understand. Now she was standing in the middle of it. She walked back to the eatery, let herself in through the back door, made coffee, even though she didn't have to, just for herself, just because she wanted it. The day passed slow. Clara read the newspaper Mrs. Ida had left on the counter, mended a tear in her spare dress, walked to the general store and bought a ribbon for her hair blue, the color of the morning sky, with 50 cents she'd earned this week. Her first purchase in Dust Creek that wasn't survival. By late afternoon, the smell of roasting chicken drifted from the eatery kitchen. Clara found Mrs. Ida at the stove, basting a bird in a pan. Her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "Thought you had the day off," Mrs. Ida said without turning around. "I do? Just," Clara paused. "Wanted to see if you needed help." "I don't." Mrs. Ida lifted the pan, tilted it to let the juices run. "But you can set the table. We've got company coming." Clara walked to the front room. The tables had been pushed together in the center, forming one long surface covered with a white cloth she'd never seen before. Mrs. Ida's good china sat stacked on the counter, white plates with blue flowers around the edges, the kind you saved for special occasions. "How many?" Clara called back. "8. Maybe 9 if the postmaster's wife decides to come." Clara counted out plates, set them around the table, one by one. Added forks, knives, spoons, folded napkins the way her mother had taught her, corners tucked in, edges straight. The bell above the door jingled. Mr. Beeman walked in, leaning on his cane. He wore a clean shirt, collar buttoned to the top, and his white hair was slicked back with something that smelled like bay rum. "Evening." "Clara." "Evening, Mr. Beeman." She pulled out a chair for him. "Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" "That'd be fine." She poured him a cup from the pot she'd made that morning. Reheated on the stove, he wrapped his hands around it, the same way he always did, and settled into the chair with a long exhale. The door opened again. The Harmons, Mr. Harmon in a vest and tie, his wife in a blue dress Clara hadn't seen before, their 2 boys scrubbed clean and squirming in their Sunday clothes. "Mrs. Harmon." "Mr. Harmon?" Clara nodded to each of them. "Boys?" "Clara." Mrs. Harmon smiled. It was a real smile, not the polite one Clara had gotten used to seeing. "That roast smells wonderful. Mrs. Ida's recipe. Her hands, too. I'd wager." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled back and showed them to their seats. More people arrived. The postmaster and his wife. A rancher named Dawson, who Clara had served 100 times but never spoken to beyond his order. A woman named Ruth who ran the boarding house and had brought a pie. The table filled up. Voices overlapped conversations about the weather, the price of cattle, someone's cousin who'd moved to California. The Harmon boys knocked over a water glass. Their mother cleaned it up without missing a beat in her conversation. Clara stood by the kitchen doorway, watching. "Where do you think you're going?" Mrs. Ida's voice came from behind her. Clara turned. "I was just... Sit down." Mrs. Ida pointed at the table. "It's Sunday supper. But I can help serve." "You've served enough." Mrs. Ida's voice was firm, but there was something underneath it, something warm. "Tonight you're a guest. Now sit." Clara looked at the table, at the faces she'd come to recognize over 6 weeks of coffee pots and dirty dishes, at Mr. Beeman with his bay rum in his trembling hands, at the Harmons and their squirming boys, at Ruth with her pie and Dawson with his worn boots and the postmaster's wife adjusting her napkin. There was one empty chair. By the window, across from a place setting that hadn't been touched yet. The bell jingled. Ethan stood in the doorway. He'd cleaned up fresh shirt, no dust on his boots, his hair combed back. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim the way he always did when he was thinking. His eyes found Clara's. He walked to the table, to the empty chair by the window. He pulled it out. Not for himself, for her. Clara's feet moved before her mind caught up. She crossed the room, stood in front of the chair, looked at Ethan. He didn't say anything. Just waited. She sat down. Ethan took the seat across from her, set his hat on the windowsill. Mrs. Ida emerged from the kitchen carrying the roast on a platter. Golden brown and glistening, she set it in the center of the table, and the smell of it rosemary, garlic, the rich fat of well-cooked meat filled the room. "All right," she said. "Let's eat." Plates were passed, food was served. Clara found herself holding a dish of mashed potatoes, spooning some onto her plate, passing it to Mr. Beeman on her left. Green beans followed, bread rolls, a bowl of gravy that Mrs. Ida had made from the drippings. The conversation continued around her easy, unforced. Someone told a story about a horse that had gotten loose last spring. The postmaster complained about the mail schedule. One of the Harmon boys asked for more bread and was told to wait until everyone else had been served. Clara ate. The chicken was tender, the skin crisp. The mashed potatoes were rich with butter. The green beans had been cooked with bacon, the way her mother used to make them. She didn't say much, didn't need to. The talk flowed around her, and she let it carry her, a voice here, a laugh there, the clink of forks against china. Mr. Beeman raised his coffee cup. To good company. Cups and glasses lifted around the table. Clara raised hers, too, the same tin cup she'd drunk from every morning for 6 weeks, now surrounded by Mrs. Ida's good china. To good company, the table echoed. They drank. Clara set her cup down, looked around at the faces, at the food, at the white tablecloth and the blue flowered plates and the candles Mrs. Ida had lit as the sun went down. This was what it looked like. Belonging. Not a grand declaration. Not a dramatic rescue. Just a table. Just food. Just people who had decided she was worth staying for. After supper, Clara helped clear the dishes. Mrs. Ida shooed her away twice, and twice Clara came back. "You're stubborn," Mrs. Ida said. "Learned from the best." Something flickered across Mrs. Ida's face, not quite a smile, but close. The guests drifted out as the evening deepened. The Harmons first, corralling their boys toward the door. Then Ruth with her empty pie plate, the postmaster and his wife. Dawson, who shook Clara's hand on his way out and said something about the biscuits being better than his late mother's. Mr. Beeman was the last to leave. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and paused beside Clara. "You did good, girl," he said. His voice was rough, but his eyes were kind. "Ethel would have liked you." He shuffled out. The bell jingled behind him. Clara stood by the window. The same window she'd looked through that first night, when she'd stood outside with 43 cents and a canvas bag and nowhere to go. The lamplight was the same. The calico curtains were the same. The table was the same. But she wasn't outside anymore. Ethan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. Just stood there, shoulder almost touching hers, looking out at the empty street. "Thank you," Clara said. "For that first night, you'd have found your way? Maybe." She watched a moth flutter against the glass, drawn by the light inside. "But you made it easier." He nodded. That was enough. They stood there as the last of the daylight faded and the stars began to show. The street outside was quiet. The eatery was warm. Somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Ida was putting away the last of the dishes, humming something Clara didn't recognize. Clara thought about the stagecoach, the canvas bag, the 43 cents she'd counted in her palm 7 weeks ago. She still had the bag. It sat in the corner of the storeroom, half unpacked. A reminder of the woman she'd been when she arrived. But she had something else now, too. A cot in a storeroom. A job that made her hands remember things her heart had tried to forget. A town full of people who'd watched her fall and helped her stand back up. A chair at a table? Clara turned from the window, looked at the room, the pushed-together tables, the leftover crumbs, the empty coffee cups waiting to be washed. Tomorrow she'd be up before dawn. She'd stoke the fire. She'd make the biscuits. She'd pour the coffee and serve the plates and wash the dishes until her hands turned red. But tonight, she'd been a guest, and that was enough. There's something quiet that stays with us after a story like this one. A kind of heaviness that sits in the chest, tender and familiar. The feeling of watching someone stand when everything in them wanted to fall. The ache of knowing what it is to arrive somewhere with nothing but hope and a few coins in your pocket. Many of us have stood outside a window like Clara did. Perhaps not the same window, not the same town, but the same distance between where we are and where we want to belong. Some of us have known what it is to carry a debt that wasn't ours to carry. To be seen by a stranger when the people who should have seen us looked away. And many of us have been the one who pulled out a chair, who said nothing but stayed anyway. Not everything in this story is resolved. That's all right. Some things are allowed to rest exactly where they are unfinished, still breathing, still tender to the touch. It's okay to sit with whatever this left behind. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.